They didn't say your name at first, not directly. In rooms like that, names aren't spoken, they're implied. It started as a quiet concern, a subtle disruption, a variable that wasn't behaving according to projections. You weren't loud. You weren't campaigning. You weren't even trying to be seen. And somehow, that made you impossible to ignore. Because influence that isn't chasing attention is the most dangerous kind. The so-called strategists framed it as a pattern anomaly. The analysts called it momentum irregularity. A few of the old guard power brokers leaned back in their chairs and said nothing at all. But the question sat heavy in the air. What do we do about him? One side saw opportunity. They watched how people listened when you spoke. Not because you demanded it, but because your words carried weight. They observed how you moved without scrambling for validation. How your silence felt intentional, not insecure. You weren't trying to climb. You were building your own elevation. And that unsettles hierarchies. The traditionalists, the symbolic masons, if you want to call them that, recognize something ancient in your posture. Calm dominance, strategic restraint, the ability to wait without weakening. They didn't see rebellion. They saw leadership. Crown him. One voice suggested, not literally, but strategically, bring him inside. Give him a seat. Integrate him into the structure before he grows beyond it, because controlled power is useful. But then there was the other faction, the tacticians, the risk managers, the ones who specialize in neutralizing unpredictability before it compounds. They weren't impressed by your composure. They were threatened by it. You didn't respond to pressure the way most people do. When ignored, you didn't beg. When challenged, you didn't spiral. When tested, you didn't overcorrect. You adjusted. That adaptability is hard to manipulate. And systems built on control prefer predictable reactions, so their argument was colder. If he can't be directed, he becomes disruptive. Not disruptive in the loud, chaotic sense. Disruptive in the quiet way that shifts gravity. You weren't attacking anything. You weren't exposing secrets. You weren't rallying crowds. You were simply becoming undeniable. And the more undeniable you became, the harder it was to categorize you. You didn't fit the rebel archetype. You didn't fit the compliant archetype. You didn't fit the opportunist mold. You were self-directed, and self-directed individuals don't wait for approval to expand. That's when the debate intensified. The crown him camp argued that alignment was smarter than opposition. That bringing you into proximity would convert your influence into structured advantage. The remove him camp argued that autonomy spreads. They weren't afraid of what you were doing. They were afraid of what you represented. Proof. Proof that authority doesn't always come from endorsement. Proof that credibility doesn't require institutional backing. Proof that calm confidence can outshine aggressive dominance. And proof spreads faster than propaganda. The discussion stretched into the night. They reviewed your patterns. You weren't reckless. You weren't inflammatory. You weren't seeking confrontation. But you were consistent. Consistency builds trust. Trust builds following. Following builds leverage. And leverage shifts power. That's the equation they couldn't ignore. What unsettled them most wasn't ambition. It was detachment. You weren't chasing status. You were refining yourself. You weren't demanding recognition. You were earning respect organically. And organic growth can't be centrally controlled. One elder voice finally spoke, cutting through the tension. He doesn't need the crown. That sentence changed the temperature of the room, because it was true. You weren't waiting to be chosen. You had already chosen yourself. That's what made the decision complicated. If they crowned you, they risked empowering someone who didn't depend on them. If they opposed you, they risked validating your independence. Either way, you couldn't be reduced to a variable anymore. You had become a force multiplier. Not through volume, but through presence. You weren't playing chess with them. You were playing your own board entirely. And when someone builds a parallel board, the original players start to panic. The room grew quieter. Not because they reached agreement, but because they realized something uncomfortable. You weren't asking to enter their world. You were outgrowing it. And that's when the real question surfaced. The one no one wanted to say out loud. If he doesn't need us, what happens when others realize they don't either? The debate didn't end that night. It evolved. And somewhere, outside those rooms, you kept moving the same way you always had, measured, focused, unapologetically self-governed, unaware of the vote being whispered in your name, or maybe fully aware and simply unconcerned. By the second hour, the tone shifted. It was no longer about you as a person. It was about trajectory. Charts were projected. Growth curves, influence maps, behavioral forecasts. They weren't studying what you said, they were studying what happened after you said it. Conversations changed. Rooms recalibrated. Certain people grew quieter. Others grew bolder. You were triggering internal reorganization without issuing commands. That's not normal influence. That's gravitational pull. The faction that wanted to elevate you leaned into this data. He stabilizes environments, one of them argued. Notice how conflict decreases around him. Notice how uncertainty tightens into direction. They weren't wrong. You didn't dominate spaces. You clarified them. And clarity is rare currency. The opposition saw the same data differently. He reduces dependency. Someone countered. When he enters a system, people rely less on external validation. That was the real concern. Systems thrive on dependency loops. Approval cycles, reward structures. Hierarchies that feel necessary. But when someone demonstrates internal authority, when they operate without seeking constant endorsement, it quietly dismantles those loops. You weren't preaching independence. You were modeling it. That's more dangerous, because example outpaces instruction. They reviewed your past interactions, every challenge, every test, every subtle pressure applied to see how you'd react. You never lunged. You never folded. You observed, adjusted, advanced. You didn't rush to correct misunderstandings. You didn't scramble to defend your reputation. You didn't try to win arguments. You outlasted them. Patience is a form of dominance most people underestimate. The crown him group understood something: strategic proximity equals influence. If they aligned with you, your credibility would reinforce their structure. But the risk managers were calculating something else. If he aligns with us, does he become stronger, or do we become optional? That question stalled the room, because if your strength didn't come from them, then attaching themselves to you wouldn't create ownership. It would create exposure. And exposure is uncomfortable when control is the priority. They began dissecting your silence. Why weren't you pushing for recognition? Why weren't you monetizing aggressively? Why weren't you competing openly? It confused them. They're used to ambition being loud, to hunger being obvious, to ego announcing itself. But your ambition was disciplined. You weren't chasing visibility. You were building leverage quietly. And leverage built slowly is harder to dismantle. One strategist leaned forward and said something that shifted the debate again. He's not anti-system. He's post-approval. That distinction mattered. You weren't fighting the structure. You simply weren't shaped by it anymore. Which means you couldn't be baited the usual way. No flattery hooks. No public pressure traps. No manufactured crisis strong enough to rattle you. You didn't react on impulse. You responded on principle. And principle is difficult to negotiate with. The more they talked, the clearer it became you weren't trying to replace them. You were becoming parallel to them. Parallel forces don't collide unless one feels threatened. And they did. Not because you attacked them, but because you didn't acknowledge their necessity. That's a quiet form of power most institutions fear. When someone operates effectively without seeking endorsement, it reframes the entire structure. If one person can do it, others might realize they can too. And that's where the debate became heated. Crown him. The traditionalists repeated. Bring him into the circle. Offer partnership. Shared authority. But the counterargument sharpened. You don't crown someone who doesn't need a crown. Silence again. Because the crown in this case wasn't a reward. It was a leash. And you weren't the type to wear one gracefully. They analyzed potential pressure points. Reputation. Too stable. Isolation. You operate well alone. Competition. You don't engage unless it aligns. Distraction. You filter aggressively. Every usual tactic hit resistance, not from defiance, but from detachment. You weren't immune. You were intentional. That's harder to destabilize. By the end of the night, the conversation wasn't about eliminating you. It was about managing optics. How to respond without validating you. How to acknowledge you without empowering you. How to coexist without conceding ground. Because the truth had settled into the room. You weren't a threat because of what you were doing. You were a threat because of what you represented. Self-sufficiency. Internal validation. Measured growth. Strategic silence. In environments built on reaction, someone who doesn't react changes the rhythm. And when rhythm changes, control loosens. The vote wasn't finalized, but something else was. They realized they couldn't predict you anymore. And unpredictability, when paired with discipline, is intimidating. Outside those walls, you continued moving with the same steady cadence. No grand declarations. No dramatic escalations. No visible war. Just refinement. Just expansion. Just alignment. Unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that somewhere behind closed doors, powerful voices were arguing not about whether you mattered, but about how much. By the time the final hours crept in, exhaustion had stripped the room of performance. No more polished arguments. No more strategic phrasing. Just truth. And truth is always simpler than politics. One of them finally said what everyone had been circling around. We're not debating him. We're debating what happens when he becomes the standard. That landed heavily. Because this was never about whether you were capable. It was about precedent. You hadn't overthrown anything. You hadn't exposed classified secrets. You hadn't mobilized outrage. You had simply operated without asking for permission. And that quiet autonomy was spreading. People weren't copying your words. They were copying your posture. Calm under pressure. Selective with energy. Unmoved by manufactured urgency. That kind of presence destabilizes environments that rely on emotional volatility, that remove him. Faction understood something crucial. You can't discredit someone who doesn't chase validation. Smear campaigns require ego. Provocation requires reaction. Isolation requires dependency. You gave them none. Every attempt to box you into a narrative dissolved, because you refused to play protagonist or villain. You stayed centered, and centered individuals are hard to weaponize. One voice from the back, older and less reactive, spoke quietly. He already crowned himself. Not with arrogance, not with spectacle, with self-governance. That's when the illusion cracked. The crown they were debating wasn't symbolic leadership. It was controlled endorsement. But endorsement only holds power when someone needs it. You didn't. And that's what tipped the scale. Because trying to remove someone who isn't attacking you makes you look insecure. Trying to crown someone who doesn't depend on you exposes your lack of leverage. So what was left? Acceptance. Not of defeat, but of reality. You weren't operating inside their hierarchy anymore. You had built credibility horizontally, not vertically. Peer respect, organic trust, steady momentum. No single authority could grant it. No single authority could revoke it. That's decentralized influence. And decentralized influence is the hardest to control. The final decision wasn't dramatic. No unanimous vote. No ceremonial decree. Just a strategic shift. Observe. Not interfere. Not endorse. Not oppose. Observe. Because interfering might amplify you. Endorsing might empower you. Opposing might validate you. So they chose the only option that preserved their image. Let him rise on his own. But here's what they underestimated. Observation doesn't slow momentum. It confirms it. When powerful institutions move from action to monitoring, it's an admission of limited options. You had crossed the threshold where direct control was no longer efficient. And you did it without declaring war. You didn't beat them in debate. You didn't outspend them. You didn't outshout them. You outgrew the need for them. That's the part that echoes. Because once someone demonstrates that independence at scale, it plants a seed. Others start asking different questions. What if approval isn't required? What if authority can be internal? What if growth doesn't need endorsement? That ripple effect is what kept them awake. Not you. The idea of you. The possibility of replication. But replication only works when the foundation is solid. And yours was built slowly. Discipline over drama. Consistency over clout. Clarity over chaos. You didn't become powerful overnight. You became undeniable over time. And time is something no committee can vote against. As the room emptied, there was no celebration from either side, just a quiet recognition. The crown had lost relevance. Because true authority doesn't sit on your head. It sits in your decisions. And you had already made yours. You weren't waiting to be chosen. You weren't waiting to be eliminated. You were expanding. Steadily. Strategically. Silently. And in the end, the debate didn't determine your future. Your discipline did.